otherwise we'll never finish. So on behalf of the Hastings and Rye Palestine Solidarity Campaign, we'd like to welcome our speakers this evening, freelance journalist and author Jonathan Cook, who is speaking to us from his home in Nazareth, Israel. Jonathan is a prolific writer on Israel and Palestine. He's written 3 books and regularly writes for a number of news outlets, including Middle East Eye, Mondo Weiss, Al Jazeera and Counterpunch. And in 2011, he won the Martha Gellhorn Special Prize for Journalism. The judges described him as one of the reliable truth tellers in the Middle East. And we have Asa Winstanley. Asa is an investigative journalist and associate editor at the Electronic Intifada, an award-winning website reporting on the global battle for justice in Palestine. He also writes a weekly column for Middle East Monitor, and much of his work since 2015 has focused on the successful campaign to smear Jeremy Corbyn as an anti-Semite. So we've titled our talk, "Why Can't We Talk About Palestine?" Because it can't have escaped anyone's notice recently. It is getting harder and harder to talk about Palestine. Our own experience as a group has been over the last few years in the course of our work to raise awareness and understanding of Palestinian history and injustices. We've been under what feels like a sustained attack. So there have been some very serious and vicious attempts to shut down our meetings through online bullying campaigns on our venues, attempts to shut down our weekly stalls, and the articles publicising our talks and events have also been taken off the web. In an almost perfect illustration of this, last week an article about this meeting went up on the Hastings Observer website, and 24 hours later it was taken down. We were told at first it was as a result of a complaint made directly to the editor, but this seemed to change later when the content editor claimed the decision was taken as a result of normal editorial processes. So was there a complaint? We still don't know. So to kick off, perhaps I can ask Asa for you to describe what you have observed in the UK in terms of attacks on the Palestinian solidarity movements in this country, and perhaps to outline something of the battleground of the fiercest of these attacks which have taken place within the Labour Party.
Hi, yeah, sure. Can everyone hear me okay? Good? Yeah, all right, great. Well, yeah, it's a big topic. Not quite sure where to start, really. I mean, if we look at the Labour Party, like you said, I'm sure most of you know, really, what we've seen over the last 5.5 to 6 years has been, a sustained attack, exactly as you described against yourself. You know, there's a sustained attack against free speech on the issue of Palestine and the Israelis. And I think a large part of the problem was that, quite simply, unfortunately, Jeremy Corbyn had the right principles, but at the end of the day, he didn't stand by them strongly enough. And that he gave too much ground, and he decided that, in giving way, that participated in his downfall. And what we've seen happen in the Labour Party is now spilling over into other sections of society. So a lot of you probably already know what's happening with Bristol University with David Miller. So for those who don't, David Miller is a sociologist at the University of Bristol who he's a really brilliant expert in lobbies and PR and propaganda, and really for a decade or more, it was a decade ago that I first met him and became familiar with his work. He's been one of the lobbies that he's been examining has been the Israel lobby. He founded an organization called Spinwatch, which researches and examines, the tobacco lobby, the arms lobby. He did a year or two back, I forget now, Spinwatch did a report about the UAE lobby. So the United Arab Emirates, puts millions and millions of its dollars into lobbying in the United States and in the UK, and they put out a really good report about that. And so naturally, he's been examining the Israel lobby over the last decade, and his research has been really useful, really essential. But he's come under a sustained attack in the last 2 years, really off the back of what happened in the Labour Party. He's been falsely accused of anti-Semitism. So this is the same weapon that gets used, that was used in the Labour Party. It's not a new strategy, it's just accelerated in recent years, and we've seen it on a national stage, really, in this country, because it was used against Jeremy Corbyn, because one of his main campaigns in his career as a backbencher, as a campaigner, as an activist, as one of the few MPs that would speak at Palestine. He's still a patron of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, last I heard. He was always there, speaking at rallies, leading rallies, chairing meetings, and so on and so forth. So when he became Labour leader, he was already the enemy of the Israel lobby. So, for example, the Jewish Chronicle. I would describe the Jewish Chronicle as the UK's #1 anti-Palestinian newspaper. It hasn't always been the case. I was doing a little bit of research on it recently. I mean, I knew about it before, but I was reading some of the background about it. Before Israel was actually founded, the Jewish Chronicle had an anti-Zionist phase, when it was actually owned by anti-Zionist Jewish proprietor, and it was against Zionism. It was against the foundation of Israel. It didn't exist then yet. It was still Palestine. But since I believe it was 2008, I may be wrong about that, when Stephen Pollard took over the paper as an editor. He's a right-wing Express columnist, who considers he once wrote a blog saying that the left in any recognizable modern form is now the enemy, because it was anti-Western and all this kind of stuff. He's run this newspaper for a while now, and it's incredibly anti-Palestinian, as I said. So it's really a kind of it's the in-house organ, I suppose, of the Israel lobby and the Zionist movement, is what I'm trying to say. I forget where I was going with that. What was I talking about? How did I get onto the Jewish Chronicle? Corbyn, yeah, that's it. Yeah, they already knew him, right? The Jewish Chronicle, they already knew him. So, we in the Palestine Solidarity movement, I think we knew who Jeremy Corbyn was, or just people in the anti-war movement would know who Jeremy Corbyn was, right? Because he was there at the 2003 and even before that, 2002, 2001 anti-war demonstrations. We knew Jeremy Corbyn, right? Because to me, as someone who got their political education in my early 20s in the anti-war movement, I always thought of the Labour Party as the war party, because it was the era of Tony Blair taking us to war against Afghanistan and Iraq, right? So, but then there would always be the odd MP, right? So, of course, Tony Benn was still alive in those days, and Jeremy Corbyn, and they would be there at the meeting. So we were familiar with him. But when Corbyn was thrashed onto the national scene, and when he became a realistic prospect for the leader of the Labour Party, all these right-wing newspapers had to play catch-up, right? And they had to start to find ways to kind of try and discredit him. And where did they turn to? Well, they turned to the Israel lobby, and that was, in the case of journalists, that was quite often led by the Jewish Chronicle, because they already knew him. They were already writing hit pieces about him years before that, trying to say, oh, isn't it terrible that he led this meeting of Palestinian refugees, the Palestinian Return Center, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, I think that it all got out of control from there. Corbyn didn't fight back against it enough, and it's now spilled over into the rest of society. and is having I mean, look, I don't want to sound like I'm blaming him alone. That's completely unfair. He was in a very difficult position and so forth. But the reality is, this kind of situation we find ourselves in now, where it's spilling over into academia, right? Like, people like me have been basically pushed out of the Labour Party. Right, I quit the Labour Party after being suspended and being held in limbo for a really long period, like a lot of other people, like I'm sure people probably in this meeting as well. But that wasn't enough, that wasn't enough for them. And the thing is, what the Israel lobby aims for is political hegemony on all levels. So now, emboldened by their successes in the Labour Party, they're moving on to academia. So we're in. Well, I don't want to sound too despairing, but we are in quite a desperate phase. Like, there's a lot of threats now, and in many ways, when I was growing up in my early 20s and I first came into the Palestine solidarity movement, reading about the movement in the US as compared to here, I always used to think things are a bit more difficult in the US, But now I kind of think it's the other way around. Actually, I think things are a bit more advanced in America, in the solidarity movement in America in some ways. And here we face a lot more constraints, I think, than we used to. We also have a lot of opportunities as well. So I don't want to be too negative, and we can probably talk about the opportunities as well. But I do think we have to be realistic as well in facing the things that we do face.
Indeed. Jonathan, it's not an issue confined to the UK, is it? You've written about the attempts across Europe and in the US, the global effort in recent years to smear, to delegitimize Palestinian solidarity movements by the Israel lobby. But can I ask you, who is this lobby exactly? What are we talking about? And why now? Why has this become such an issue now?
Okay, well, let me maybe talk first about why now, and then also I want to apologize for the red devilish tinge that I seem to have attracted tonight. I've got some problems with the lighting here, so sorry about that. But maybe I'll start with the why now, and then try and think about what Israel is trying to achieve here. I don't think we should think of this as something that's specifically new. I think it's a sort of culmination of a series of crises for Israel that has put it onto the offensive, because one could argue that it's made some strategic mistakes, or one could think that the information environment has turned, to use that kind of CIA terminology, has turned rather hostile to Israel at the moment, or has been over the last 10 years. And part of that's Netanyahu, I suppose, and the rise, this sort of unadulterated right-wing, ultra-right-wing dominance in Israel. There's no way you can gloss who Netanyahu is and what he represents and how strongly he's supported. So I think it's been kind of hard for Israel to sell itself as wanting a peace process, being involved in a two-state solution, looking for a two-state solution. The whole Oslo alibi has just disappeared for Israel. So, I mean, it's not even pretending it's interested in any of that. So that's caused a major image problem for it. I think you also have to factor in that social media has changed the whole way we talk to each other and the way we can bypass corporate media, mainstream media, whatever you want to call it. That monopoly on information gathering and information dissemination has had this blip with social media, and suddenly we can start to talk about things. In a sense, Israel loses the control over the narrative, which I think has been a problem for Israel. There's been, for Palestinians, they've found ways to regain control of the narrative themselves through, I'm thinking particularly through phone cameras and so on, that they can visually record the kind of horrors going on in the West Bank. Before, if they would tell, I mean, if they could get a journalist to cover it, which would be a problem in itself, but if they could get one to cover it, you would get instant dismissals from Israel. Even when they first got these very primitive phone cameras, you would hear Israelis saying this they invented this term Pallywood, Palestinian Hollywood, that it was just sort of fake. But with high definition cameras and all of that, it's just very hard to do that anymore. So there's a lot of visual documentation going on, which is very difficult for Israel to counteract that. There's the emergence of a global solidarity movement with a campaign. One of the problems for Palestinian solidarity activists around the world was there wasn't really clear what their role was until the BDS movement arrived, and suddenly there was a way that you could be in Washington or London or Paris or whatever, and you could actually mobilize and do something. You could get involved in Palestinian solidarity in a practical kind of way. And I think that was a very rapid educational process for many people. Through that kind of activism, they learned a lot more about what was going on with Israel. And I think that caused a lot of problems for Israel. Netanyahu's done a lot. I mentioned this about sort of hard to gloss over who Netanyahu is and what he represents, but he's done a lot to push the kind of Jewish supremacist ideas that Israel are very dominant in Israel now into the public space where you can't ignore them. I'm thinking of something like the nation-state law, which just makes it kind of clear that Israel isn't even pretending to be a democracy, which sort of pulls the rug under its supporters and has forced them on to be more aggressive.
So can you just explain to those who might not know what the nation-state law is exactly?
Well, the essence of it is it's saying that only Jews have a right to self-determination it's a little bit unclear whether it just means inside Israel's borders or it just means the land of Israel, which would include the occupied territories as well. But the idea of it essentially is to say that this is Jewish territory, pretty much all of it, and the Palestinians don't really have any historic claim on it. So there are lots of other ugly bits to it as well, undermining the right to an Arabic language for Palestinians inside Israel and so on. But generally, the whole ethos of it is pretty ugly. It's pretty Jewish supremacist. It's very hard to conceal all of that. And so the nation-state law was passed, I think it was summer of 2018. So that was a really tough one for the lobby to try and sell that as something that could be ignored. And I think this is as part of a pattern under Netanyahu. You saw it with the appointment of Tzipi Hotovely as the ambassador to the UK. I mean, these sort of ultra-nationalists, they don't conceal anything. It's all out on the table. It's very hard for the lobby to gloss over what Israel is. So Netanyahu is giving them a bit of a headache in that way. You've seen the emergence of a new sort of partisanship on Israel. Okay, it's mine. As Asa mentioned, with Jeremy Corbyn obviously being really an unprecedented development in European politics to see a politician like Corbyn who isn't not only criticized, is prepared to prioritize Palestinian rights over Israel's right to occupy the Palestinians, which I don't think you can say any European politician has ever done before. I mean, it's shocking as though that sounds when you say it like that, but no European politician has done that. So that's a new development. You've also got in America parallel developments with Ilhan Omar and the Squad and so on, who are suddenly bringing Palestinian politics into a political arena where nobody had been talking about that really. It was just a given that America was in lockstep with Israel, whatever it did. And you've also got this increasing visibility of a one-state solution. I wouldn't say legitimacy to it, but a visibility. People are talking about one-state solution and why not, and what's bad about it. It's there somewhere in the debate. And that's seen as a big threat by Israel, because once you start talking about, well, why doesn't everybody just live happily all together with equal rights? You get into that discourse about equal rights. Israel's really in a difficult position. Suddenly has to start, Zionism starts to look slightly more problematic than most British Jews, for instance, are very comfortable thinking about it as a political ideology that denies Palestinians any notion or possibility of equality. So all of these things have sort of come together, I think. They're all different factors which just have put the Israel lobby initially on the defensive. And so what we're seeing is because you've lost that sort of nice gloss on what Israel is, what Zionism is, it's all looking a bit ugly. in a sense, I think the lobby has said, well, okay, we're kind of in a difficult position here. Let's just take the gloves off and go on the attack and just attack anybody who says anything bad about us as an anti-Semite. We can't play the diplomatic game anymore. So we'll just crush all free speech on this matter. So it's all got much uglier. And well, maybe if we talk, that provides opportunities from our point of view as well, of course. So I think that's the background to this, that we should remember that in a sense, the Israel lobby, it's a sign of its weakness that it's really going all out for this kind of aggressive, repressive, anti-free speech. I mean, you saw it with Gavin Williamson, this ridiculous contradiction in his position, where he's saying that he wants to outlaw no platforming by universities at the same time as he's demanding that British universities outlaw no platform critics of Israel. So all these kind of contradictions are just very difficult for the lobby. So in a sense, it looks very strong, but I think there's a sort of hollowness to it at the same time. It's a sort of theatrics, has clear damaging political repercussions as well. But there is a sense in which the image game is up for the lobby, I think, and why it's gone on.
We use that term, don't we? Israel lobby. It's a bit of a shorthand.
Yeah.
But who are we referring to? And can we sort of just be a bit more specific about what that term means?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think it is difficult. Two famous American academics wrote a very long book trying to define what it is. So it's not an easy thing to define. The Israel lobby, I think, well, one can find components in it. Obviously, at the heart of it, there are elements of the Israeli state which are trying to mobilize supporters around the world. And you have Jewish leadership, well, I tend to call them Jewish leadership organizations, but you have these institutions and in many different formats. In the UK, for instance, I would think of the Israel lobby as being obviously groups like the Board of Deputies. You have these more focused groups. I mean, in a sense, the Board of Deputies is some kind of umbrella organization claiming to represent British Jews and speak for them, while it's also speaking for Israel and not have any particular problem with that blurred voice it's speaking with. Then you have these more focused kinds of organizations which are trying to deal with specific issues. You have the Community Security Trust, you have Campaign Against Anti-Semitism and so on. Then you have movements within political parties. So you have the Jewish Labour movement, which are trying to control the discourse within political movements to stop it developing there. You've also got Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel, and so on. So they're doing their own lobby work inside organizations. You could argue that the lobby is now diffusing. I mean, I find it frightening to think that somebody like Ruth Smith, who was clearly an Israel lobbyist when she was working for Viacom and other of these Jewish organizations, is now the head of Index on Censorship. What does that mean? Here's somebody who's trying to silence people talking about Israel, who's now in charge of the main free speech organization. I mean, it's just terrifying, really, when one thinks about it. So the lobby, in that sense, is quite broad, and it can embrace all sorts of organizations, even something like Index on Censorship. In America, you see it with organizations. There's a certain way in which the lobby tries to disguise itself, because it doesn't want to be too obviously that it's promoting Israeli interests. So you see an organization in America like the Anti-Defamation League, which sounds great. Who's in favor of defamation? I mean, you want there to be an Anti-Defamation League, but actually what is really there is to stop you defaming Israel or criticizing Israel, we could also call it. So there's a certain level of veiled lobbying, and then there's some explicit lobbying, and then there's some special interest groups which are doing. So it's quite amorphous and quite difficult to pin it down exactly. But you can chart the sort of broad strokes of it fairly easily. And I think one needs to keep an eye on the personnel, because people tend to move around between these groups. It's quite incestuous in that way. And so you can often spot, Ruth Smith being a good example, but somebody like Ella Rose, for instance, there she is working in the Israeli embassy, and suddenly she pops up in the Jewish Labour movement. So you start to think, well, what's she really doing there? Is she there just promoting Jewish voices in the Labour Party, as the Jewish Labour movement would often try and present itself, or is she actually promoting some other kind of agenda? So there are lots of things going on here. I think that Israel obviously doesn't direct these things explicitly, but it's kind of there like a conductor in an orchestra. So it's trying to make sure everybody's on the same page, working in roughly the same direction. It's got these think tanks that are trying to work out how best to silence critics and so on, and it will then disseminate that information to useful groups who are doing that kind of work, and then they can work from a more informed environment. So that's probably my best way of trying to explain what it is.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, yeah, one of the most contentious issues in the last few years has been the attempts by the Israeli government and supporters to push for the worldwide adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism. So, Asa, what are the issues with this definition, and what would you say, or can you give us examples of real-world consequences of its adoption?
Yeah, it's a very misleading definition, and there is some very real world consequences to it. Do you mind if I give a little bit of an answer about the lobby as well first before I get to that? Is that okay?
Sure.
Yeah. Okay. So, it's a really good question that you asked. Like, what do we mean when we say the Israel lobby? So in my view, it is a diffuse global network of organizations which are, the way Jonathan described it was good. You know, Israel is there. They're not necessarily all directed directly by Israel or controlled top down by Israel, but most of them, almost all of them, I would say, to a greater or lesser degree, have at least some sort of coordination with the state of Israel. Others to a greater degree. Others are simple shell organizations and front groups, and others just have a loose sort of support for the state of Israel. And it varies in degrees, right? So you have, as Jonathan mentioned, you have organizations inside the political parties in America and Britain. So, for example, AIPAC, the America-Israel Public Affairs Committee, is well known for, you know, plowing millions and millions of dollars into lobbying for the state of Israel. You know, that's what it does. And we have the nearest equivalent we have here in this country are the Friends of Israel group. So you have Conservative Friends of Israel, Labour Friends of Israel, and there is a Liberal Democrats Friends of Israel. It's not very well known. Even at one stage, it may still exist, I don't know, but there was a UKIP Friends of Israel, which had, you couldn't have made it up, but its symbol was anti-Semitic. Like, it was literally a Star of David with a pound sign in the middle. Because it, you know, the UKIP logo had the pound sign on it. They didn't think that one through too much because that was clearly anti-Semitic. So yeah, I mean, you have these organizations, and what they do is they lobby inside political parties, you know. So, you know, I think what we have to try and do is, at the same time as maintaining criticisms of the Israel lobby and showing why we're opposed to it. We're not opposed to lobbying, right? Because you can argue that what we're doing as a Palestine solidarity movement, in a way, parts of it are lobbying. This is political lobbying. Lobbying in itself is not the issue. The issue is how that is done. Is it done in an honest, transparent, democratic fashion? And for what purposes? So, of course, you know, us as the Palestine solidarity movement would say that Israel lobby organizations are lobbying for a violent, racist, apartheid state and for the promotion of its policies within our country, you know, for political support, political, military, economic support for that state and for its oppression of the Palestinians. That's why that lobbying is a problem. So you have all these organizations. And as I said, some of them are very much front groups for the state of Israel. So just to give a brief example, or they have direct links, coordination, operative links with Israel, the state of Israel, the Israeli embassy, even Israeli intelligence organizations in some cases. So one example is the group in America that Jonathan mentioned, the Anti-Defamation League, right? Which presents itself as a civil rights organization which defends Jewish people in America from anti-Semitism. But what its main role has been over the last decades, really, has been as a lobby group for Israel and attacking critics of Israel as anti-Semites. So in the 80s and 90s, the ADL actually operated a spy ring in the United States on behalf of the state of Israel, and it maintained files. It infiltrated an undercover agent, a man named Roy Bullock, into left-wing groups, Palestinian rights groups, and it reported on all these people, and it then sold this information on to Israel and to apartheid South Africa, because it was keeping track on the anti-apartheid movement as well. So, you know, and we know, as Jonathan mentioned, about the Jewish labor movement, and how one of the executive committee of the Jewish labor movement she's still in it now. She's not the director anymore, Ella Rose, but she worked at the Israeli embassy and had a direct working professional relationship with Shai Massot, the Israeli embassy agent. So, you know, me and Jonathan have written tons about this, and you can read more about it at electronicintifada.net and at Jonathan Cook's excellent blog, and the various places that he writes. So we could talk about that all night. There's all sorts of things to talk about there. But yeah, it's so I suppose my main point that I was trying to get to there is that the lobby is diffuse, it's complicated, but at the end of the day, it is trying to lobby for the racist apartheid state. And so I think that's what we should get across. But it's similar to other countries, right? Saudi Arabia has a massive multi-million-dollar, lobbies that tries to promote its policies in Washington, D.C., in London, in Paris, no doubt, although I don't know as much about that. And the UAE, as I mentioned, does as well. So the question is, why wouldn't Israel be doing that? Of course they're doing it. Of course they are. Of course Israel lobbies this. So to get onto your actual question about the IHRA. So the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance came out with this, what it called a working definition of anti-Semitism in 2016. So despite the attempts to sort of portray it as its proponents tend to portray it as the consensus definition of anti-Semitism. Actually, nothing could be farther from the truth. It's incredibly controversial and becoming increasingly so. It's really a very misleading document. It's a misleading definition of anti-Semitism. And the reason for that is because the document contains, first of all, it contains a definition of anti-Semitism, which is being described as very vague and not very useful as an actual definition. And then, but the main problem with it, so that in itself is a problem because it's vague and not very useful. But the main problem then comes in the example. So attached to this definition, and quite often when people say the definition, they're actually including the examples as well, more often than not. There's 11 so-called examples of anti-Semitism. Now, 7 of those 11 examples mention the state of Israel, and are really about really defending Israel from criticism and not defending Jewish people from prejudice, violence, anti-Semitism. So so to give one example, it says that I don't have it in front of me, but in essence, it says that defining a state of Israel as a racist endeavor could be an example of anti-Semitism. So that is what that in effect is saying to Palestinians, is that if they talk about what happened to them in their history when they were expelled, when 800,000 of them were expelled between 1947 and 1949, when the state of Israel was being founded, if they talk about how that was racist against them because it was only directed against Palestinian Arabs, then that in effect, the definition is claiming that anti-racism is racism, is anti-Semitism. So that is the main problem with the definition. And it is used, as you said, it is used by Israel and its lobby to defend its crimes and to shut down and to chill free speech. So the example that I normally go to for that is there was, I believe it was at the end of 2019, it may have been last year, everything all blends into one now, but there was the big ride for Palestine. So, which is this, well, I'm sure a lot of you have heard of it. It's basically a sponsored cycling event for cyclists to get together. You know, they all cycle down the same route together, wave some Palestinian flags, they rally at the end, they have a few speeches, they go home, and they've raised money for a Palestinian cause. So on that particular year, it was to be, I think it was going to medical aid for Palestinians. So it was a project for Palestinian children's mental health, supporting mental health in the Gaza Strip, I believe. And they applied to permission from the council, Tower Hamlets Council in East London, to use one of their public parks as a rallying point. You know, they applied as that. I suppose they wanted to go through all the hoops and whatnot. Although they could have, I suppose, just done it. But they wanted to, I guess, dot all the I's and cross all the T's, and then that was refused. So, and they weren't really given a convincing reason for the refusal. They weren't told anything. They fobbed them off with some reason. I think what they were told, I'd have to go back to the story that I wrote about this to check, but I'm pretty sure what they were told was that their parks are not allowed to be used as rallying points for politics, for political speeches, which is clearly untrue, because they subsequently found out that the mayor of Tower Hamlets himself had held during the election campaign to be mayor of Tower Hamlets, had held rallies there himself. So it was clearly a pretext. So they weren't buying the reasons that they were told. So they put the Palestine Solidarity Campaign put in a freedom of information request to the council to find the reasons for the decision. Lo and behold, after pressing the council some months later, they found out that actually it was the IHRA working definition that was used internally by council officers as their internal justification for shutting down this event. You know, it's the most non-confrontational kind of fluffy, uncontroversial form of Palestine solidarity you could imagine. You know, a sponsored bike ride for Palestinian children's mental health. Who could possibly object to that except for racists? But it shows that, and I don't think these council officers who made this decision were necessarily personally racist against Palestinians, but they had this the council had adopted this definition, right? The council officers were aware of the definition, and they said, well, you know, this could be interpreted in this way because it says on their website, you know, Israel is involved in apartheid against Palestinians. That could be interpreted as anti-Semitism under the IHRA definition. So this is really, to me, this is a prime example of how what the problem with this definition. And again, I briefly mentioned David Miller, the academic at Bristol University, who's, you know, that Zionist organizations, activists, pro-Israel groups, the Israel lobby are trying to get fired at the moment. What they're saying is that his analysis of his research into the Israel lobby, into the Zionist movement, his published research was been online, you know, for a decade or so. That is anti-Semitic under the IHRA definition. So, you know, again, it's an example of what I was talking about before, the spillover from the Labour Party. The IHRA definition was really launched at when the whole Labour anti-Semitism smear campaign was really kicking off in 2016. That's when it first came about. The definition itself is actually older, but it was called something else. It was called the HRC definition, and then that was kind of abandoned because it was fought back against so much, and it came back in this new incarnation. So yeah, it is a big problem, and it does need to be campaigned against. And I'm glad to see that the Palestine Solidarity Campaign nationally is now launching, is campaigning against it. You know, belatedly, some people would probably argue, but they are doing that. So that's a good development.
It has been used, hasn't it, as a weapon to chill speech on Israel. And Jonathan, Israel silences its own internal critics and has done for many years with a series of draconian laws, which were introduced to outlaw support for boycott movements and curtail free speech in recent years. Can you tell us something of the impact of these laws and how it affects our ability to hold Israel to account for international law violations?
Yeah, well, we should remember, obviously, Israel is a very highly ideological society. It has at its core this idea of military service. There's a very strong security ideology in Israel. So to step outside of that world in Israel, you're already exposing yourself to the opprobrium of most of the population. It's a very difficult thing, which is why what is described usually in Israel as the Zionist left, we wouldn't even think of as left. So for me, you know, in Israel, the term leftist has become pejorative. It's probably the equivalent of what back in the 1950s US would have been called a communist. It's got that same kind of connotation of subversive, betraying the homeland, all of that kind of idea. The left in Israel, the so-called left in Israel, is divided and weak. It's got kind of two elements to it. The larger part of it is what is usually described as the Zionist left, which usually limits itself to criticisms of the occupation. And there's a degree of, or has been historically, a degree of tolerance towards that kind of approach. As long as you kept the criticism just to the worst excesses of the occupation, people kind of accepted. They didn't necessarily accept it, but they accepted your right to say that, those kind of things. And then there was a much smaller anti-Zionist or non-Zionist left that was either questioning or directly criticizing Israel's Jewish supremacist ideology. So it wasn't just talking about what was going on in the occupied territories, it was also talking about what was going on, particularly for Palestinians inside Israel, their treatment, and connecting these two things and saying what's going on in the occupied territories to Palestinians. There's this kind of veneer of a security rationale for it, but actually this very similar policies are going on towards Israel's Palestinian minority, or a fifth of the population. These are the Palestinians that weren't expelled. They're a very small number that weren't expelled in 1948, but because they've had a much larger birth rate, they're now a substantial part of the population, 20%. So the kind of discrimination, and it's more than discrimination, exclusion really from any real meaningful notion of citizenship inside Israel, so in terms of nationality. Those Israeli Jews who were aware of this and criticizing it were really seen as beyond the pale. They were outside any kind of reasonable discourse within Israel. Nobody kind of accepted their right to speak. And that's really pretty much always been the case. Now, what's been interesting in the last 10 years or so is with the rise of the ultra-right, Netanyahu and people further to the right even than him, he's quite moderate really by Israeli standards nowadays, that has forced a kind of clarification process on what we call the Israeli left. So inside Israel, you end up getting most of the left has moved towards what's sometimes called in Israel the center left, which I would call the right. People like Lapid and Gantz, the guy who was going to displace Netanyahu but failed to do it, the military general who was responsible for trashing Gaza in 2014. So he's seen as now the left, the center left, the acceptable left. And so that clarification process forced most of the left to where they really were, which is the militaristic right. But it did force those people who couldn't do that to start to say, okay, I can't go along with this militaristic right-wing kind of ideology. I can no longer square the circle the way Israel is going. And you started to see a slight emergence of an anti-Zionist left, a noticeable one, beyond a few academics and human rights activists. And that process been accelerated in recent years, again by the nation-state law, this sort of Jewish supremacist law that was passed in 2018. And I think it was also accelerated by the moves towards annexation that were planned and talked a great deal about before the peace deal with the UAE and so on, which put it on temporary hold. But this vision now, really, the political discussion in Israel is about when do we annex, not do we annex, or is it wrong to annex? So all of that kind of political culture has really forced a kind of real left to emerge. Very small. I don't want to oversell this. It's a very small left, but it is more identifiably left wing. It's more identifiably anti-Zionist, and it is more vocal. And I think we can attribute certain significant developments to it recently. The most important one being, I would say, B'Tselem's report calling everything that's going on, both in the occupied territories and inside Israel, as apartheid. Now, that's something many of us here have been saying for a long time. That's not news to us, but it is a big development for an Israeli, a very mainstream human rights organization internationally, and a very visible one inside Israel, to be calling everything about Israel apartheid. That's a big deal. I don't think we should underestimate what a big deal that is. So, in a sense, the Israeli left is coming out of it, out from underneath the rock to say we're here. And one of the things I remember very much when I first arrived here was there was a big debate on the Israeli left about whether we should launder our dirty washing in public. You know, we should just have this conversation in Hebrew among ourselves and talk about the bad things we're doing, and then resolve it among ourselves and never go public and never talk about this. This was a left-wing position in Israel. And so it's a big deal now that groups like B'Tselem are saying all of this in English, and are saying it in public, and introducing it into the sort of global debate about Israel. Okay, it's not necessarily getting much traction in the media in the West, but that's a different issue. That's our problem, not their problem. So with this sort of a gradual emergence of a more vociferous, more vocal, more intellectually robust left in Israel, you have seen inevitably a kind of intensification of repressive measures. And I think there are a few laws which are very clearly designed to kind of repress this or isolate these internal critics and stop them influencing outsiders. The most noticeable of them, I suppose, was the Anti-Boycott Law of 2011, which is particularly interesting because it makes no distinction between whether people inside Israel, are demanding a boycott of the settlements or of Israel itself. So you can't even be against the settlements and want to do something practical about it without violating this law. And it exposes you to unlimited, you can be sued by anybody who's affected this. In other words, it's a license for the settlers to sue critics of the settlements for unlimited damages. So it's quite a repressive measure in that way. You know, it's quite a sword hanging over you as an Israeli to now speak out vociferously in any way in favor of boycotts. It also empowers the government to impose financial penalties on non-government organizations. So primarily here we're talking about human rights organizations like B'Tselem, to try and keep them from, shut them down, or not try and prevent them from speaking. So it's a kind of anti-free speech on the settlements as much as anything else, this law. And it's trying to stop Israel, because there's a slippery slope here from Israel's point of view. Once Israeli critics start talking about boycotting settlements, well, maybe this will drift into a conversation about whether we should boycott the government and the institutions which are supporting the settlements. You know, how do you draw a line and just say it's just going on? You know, Israeli banks are in the occupied territories. Lots of Israeli companies are in the occupied territories. How do you draw a line between the branches that are in the occupied territories and the rest of the companies and institutions that aren't, that are inside Israel? Very it's not really a very logical position to adopt. So Israel was very worried about this sort of drift into something else. I think it's also significant, this law banning entry of, it was an amendment to a law on entry into Israel. So BDS activists, boycott activists, are now theoretically, I mean, it's quite difficult to identify all of them, of course, but if they can be identified, can be banned from entering Israel. And of course, this doesn't just mean entering Israel, because Israel controls access to the occupied territories. So it's also a ban on people getting into the occupied territories. And this has been a way to stop Palestinians, academics, human rights organizations getting into the occupied territories to monitor the abuses going on there. So that's a way to sort of shut down the monitorability of these organizations to monitor. One can think of Human Rights Watch. Omar Shakir, who was the director there, got kicked out because he once said something vaguely in favor of BDS years before he became local director of Human Rights Watch. But the ban is also interestingly targeting Jewish activists as well. So we've seen rabbis not being allowed into Israel because they've supported BDS. We saw in 2018 Peter Beinart, this very prominent American Jewish scholar, journalist, who was very mainstream, nearly being banned. I mean, he was held and interrogated, wasn't allowed into the country. It looked like he wasn't going to get in. And this is an interesting idea as well, because it changes the whole Zionist vision of what Israel is. Israel is supposedly a sanctuary for all Jews. And then suddenly there's this kind of litmus test you have to pass, that you're loyal to kind of Netanyahu vision of Israel, ultra-rightist vision of Israel, before you're allowed into the country. So it's a real turnaround, which I'm surprised there wasn't more protest about it from within Jewish communities, because it does undermine the whole idea of Zionism, what it's there for. And it was clear that this sort of entry ban was designed to have a chilling effect. And I think particularly on Jews who are likely to come to Israel, who of a leftist anti-occupation bent. I think that the thinking behind it was it would intimidate them into silence, for fear that they couldn't get into Israel to see family, to go to bar mitzvahs or whatever, weddings and so on, that they'd be isolated from the rest of their family. So there was a kind of retaliation and revenge principle going on here, I think, as well. In addition to that, you see Israeli Jews who are being intimidated, I think it would be the best way to put it. We're seeing that increasingly it's been going on for a while now, but Israeli Jews, leftists, are getting pulled over at Ben Gurion Airport, the main airport into Israel, for questioning about their political activities. They're getting called in by the Shin Bet, Israel's secret police, being warned off their, getting too actively involved in things. You're seeing schools and universities that are denying are being denied the right to host human rights organizations, anti-occupation movements, groups like Breaking the Silence, which is a group of former soldiers who, through their military experience in the occupied territories, have come to realize how bad the occupation is and want to tell other Israelis about what's going on. So they've been pretty much banned from talking to anybody, but particularly getting into schools and so on. And we saw it recently after that B'Tselem report I mentioned on apartheid. You saw that the director of B'Tselem, who had been invited by a sort of fairly progressive democratic school to talk, the education ministry issued a sort of ultimatum to the school that they weren't allowed to host him. There's actually nothing in the education law to support that. It was just a kind of unilateral decision by the education ministry, which had no legal basis whatsoever. And the meeting went ahead, and then the principal of the school was called in and severely reprimanded and so on. So there's a lot of that kind of intimidation of even open-mindedness on the part of maybe a principal. The principal didn't actually necessarily support the B'Tselem report, just thought that pupils ought to be exposed to the arguments and had somebody right-wing to counteract it. So it'd be a debate. Even the debate is being stopped. There are other kinds of things going on. The Nakba law of 2011, which was originally intended to criminalize any commemoration of the Nakba and therefore criminalize any kind of recognition of Israel's origins. This was supposed to get passed, but this was back in 2011. Obama was president then, and I think his view was that this would have looked really bad, that you were jailing people for trying to talk about history. And so eventually it was watered down, but it's still a pretty bad law, because it means that any public institution, schools, universities, libraries, anything like that, can be penalized financially if they in any way recognized as an Nakba. So they have to be really careful about what they do. The Culture Ministry, which is under a very right-wing figure, Miri Regev, has been cracking down on any kind of among Palestinian artistic groups, theaters and so on. They're getting into serious trouble, getting their funding withdrawn if they're seen to represent in any cultural form Palestinian experience. Israeli Jewish theater groups and cultural organizations are now under an obligation to go and perform in settlements. If they refuse to do that, they lose their funding and so on. So these kind of financial penalties to try and take any discussion about what's going on out of the public realm. There's all sorts of levels: history, schools, cultural events, all of this, political activism and so on. It's all being sort of squeezed to try and stop Israeli Jews becoming too visible. I think there's a reason for this, because one of the things I think the Israel lobby is very concerned about is this internal dissent among Jews, the idea that Jews don't speak with one voice on this matter. So you see this in the UK with the way the Israel lobby has cultivated this very anti-Semitic idea of the wrong kind of Jew. And you see it inside Israel as well. I mean, it's more established there. It's always been an element of this anyway. But I think it's got stronger with this idea of subversive Jews inside Israel, those who are betraying the nation. This is really being cultivated quite strongly and has been for a while now.
You mentioned, Jonathan, you talk about the B'Tselem report, which, as you notice, is pretty much a landmark report and a game changer. But you'd have had to have searched pretty hard to find much reference to it in traditional news media outlets here. And I mean, that's very similar to your reports, Asa. I mean, you've broken some huge scoops recently about what's been going on in the Labour Party. Most recently, a big scoop about a former Israeli spy, Asaf Kaplan, being employed by Keir Starmer's office. And Kaplan worked for a really unpleasant unit called the Unit 8200, which was a high-tech surveillance outfit that spied on Palestinians, using information they found out on ordinary civilians to control, blackmail, coerce, and harass them. And you'd think this guy working in, Keir Starmer's office might be big news here, but like many of his stories, there's been absolute silence, really, from the traditional news media. So, what do you think's going on here? Why the big silence, and why don't we hear about these things?
Yeah, it's again another good question and another big question. In that particular instance, there was so I did hear that from a reliable source that there was one Guardian journalist who actually did want to cover that story, approached the Labour Party for comment. The Labour Party spin doctors told them this, tried to persuade them, this is not a story, don't write about it, it's not a reliable source. But they didn't deny it, because they can't deny it because it's true. But they, so from what I hear, this particular journalist persisted in this, wanting to do the story, but the Labour Party press people basically appealed over the journalist's head to their editor and talked to the editor and said, don't do the story. Now, so, I mean, that's an example of, this is not the Israel lobby, because that was the Labour Party spin doctors doing that, right? Quashing the story. But we see, I suppose, a kind of indirect influence of the Israel lobby there, I suppose, in a way, because there was there's this kind of new right-wing hegemony in the Labour Party, from the top. So it's still contested very much at the membership, although people are being purged and driven out and so forth. There is still this right-wing hegemony under Keir Starmer and his lackeys, and part of that is their new Israel-friendly image, which includes taking money from the Israel lobby. Like Keir Starmer, we now know, only after his election win. He didn't disclose it until after he won the leadership election. He was funded tens of thousands of pounds by a major Israel lobby donor. You know, someone who's funded all sorts of Israel lobby groups, you know, including Labour Friends of Israel and so forth, and was also behind the so-called Independent Group for Change, the breakaway MPs. If you remember, had this short-lived political party which went nowhere. Someone in the comments saying £50,000. It was £50,000. I think it might have been £40,000. Anyway, I've written about it. It's there in one of my articles. But it was a substantial amount of money, is the point. So, you know, Israel, like other oppressive countries, other racist and dictatorial countries, they struggle for support. They struggle for support, from popular support. Like, there's very few people in this country, or even increasingly in America at the grassroots level, who are going to support Saudi Arabia, the UAE, or Israel. So therefore, it has to be kind of engineered from the top, right? Either by what amounts to a legal bribe, essentially, right? By this kind of legal political funding, but it's really, in my view, corrupt. We see it especially more, the influence of money in politics. We see it in America as well. Or by fear, right? By the threat of censorship, encouraging laws, for example, which suppress BDS. We've seen in America, you know, many states in America have passed laws chilling, not quite outlawing BDS, but trying to make it illegal in some indirect way or another. These laws will eventually, in my view, be overthrown because of the First Amendment in America. You know, the right to free speech, but we don't have that here, so it's kind of a problem. What accounts for this kind of censorship? I mean, I think there's a wide variety of factors, essentially, but this kind of what we've seen in the last 6 years in the Labour Party, I think is a major part of it. You know, there is fear. So, like, when we've seen this kind of censorship, even just of that, like you mentioned, that the advertising for this meeting, even in the local press, I think it's more often than not, it's just that they see it. People in mainstream media see it as a hassle. They don't want to. There's this idea in corporate media of balance, which sounds great, right? You want to be balanced and fair, but in theory, but in practice, what it amounts to is an indefinite kind of he said, she said kind of thing. And in my view, the role of journalism should really be to actually get to the truth as far as is possible. And in the case of Palestine and the Israelis, there is, of course, complicated aspects to it, but it's a fundamentally simple issue. It's a case of a racist settler colonial movement, which, under the auspices of the British Empire, sought to establish a new nation at the cost of the indigenous people, you know. And in that respect, Israel is not unique in the world, you know. It has unique, you know, every situation is different, but it's not unique in that way. You know, there's other settler colonial nations, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and of course Algeria and apartheid era South Africa, you know, which is probably the most similar, I would say. But so, you know, these kind of things are viewed in mainstream corporate media by editors and journalists as something that's complicated, or it's that, oh, it's a bit, it's difficult and all this kind of thing. So they, therefore, if they report on something to do with Israel, they know they're going to come in criticism from both sides as they view it. So it's just viewed as too much hassle. But so they don't do it. But again, it's not just that. There is the influence of the Israel lobby. We have. So you see it in the Guardian. Like the Guardian has become. It's changed. From the days when Jonathan could speak to this more than me, where he's got personal experience of it of the Guardian. But this kind of flack and attacking journalism critical of Israel as quote unquote anti-Semitic, it does have an effect, and it has it's kind of, they see it as a war of attrition, really, and the state of Israel does see their campaign against the global movement for justice in Palestine as a war. They do see it very much. There was a few years ago an article in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, an interview with one of the diplomats at the Israeli embassy in London, and the journalist had a tour around the Israeli embassy, and he described what he called a war room in the Israeli embassy, and the front was Britain's campuses, and the enemy forces were the different activist groups. So that's people like yourselves, so they see it as this kind of war, and they use this warlike language. And that's no coincidence, because more often than not, the people in the Israeli embassy coordinating with the Israel lobby groups come from Israeli military intelligence or other Israeli intelligence organizations, and they see it. And Asaf Kaplan is a perfect example of that. So, he was a former officer in Israeli military intelligence, a junior one. He was very young at the time, but he stayed on past his theoretically compulsory conscription, although it's extremely easy to escape from conscription, and the majority of Israelis do escape from conscription. Contrary to what is quite often thought, it's theoretically compulsory, but it's quite easy to get out of it. But this man, Asaf Kaplan, he stayed on for almost 5 years in this particular unit that you described, Unit 8200, a unit of military intelligence. So it's clearly something that he thought that he wanted to do, that he supported, that he thought would be beneficial to his career. And, he was right, because it got him this job later in the Israeli Labour Party and now in the British Labour Party. The Unit 8200 is essentially the cyber warfare wing of Israeli military intelligence. It's involved in mass surveillance against Palestinians for the purposes of harassing them, for the purposes of carrying out assassinations on Palestinians, presumably Palestinian freedom fighters in the Gaza Strip, although we don't know that. We know from whistleblowers' testimonies that they were involved in what they had a jargon inside Unit 8200, which was called, quote unquote, blood on the headset. So in their headsets where they were sitting at their computers, their colleagues would put an X on their headset every time they were involved in an assassination of a Palestinian. So this is the kind of person, and that was exactly the same period that Asaf Kaplan was inside Unit 8200 that these whistleblower testimonies come from. So this organization, it's serious business, and we know that these kind of organizations are expanding their view globally. So Israel sees itself in a war globally because Israel relies on support from especially the United States, but also increasingly Britain and EU countries for political, military, and economic support. Because it relies on this outside support in an almost unique fashion in many ways.
You talk about the propaganda war, and I suppose one of the most ferociously fought arenas for this has been online in recent years. And Jonathan, you've written about the undemocratic power of the big tech and social media corporations. You describe them as the monopolistic communication grids, now delivering news to huge swathes of the global population on or not if you're in Australia, but I think they've got it back now. But can you describe something of the relationship between the Israeli government and the big tech companies like Facebook, Google, and Zoom, and something about the effect on the digital rights of Palestinians and their supporters?
Yeah, sure. I'd just like to just briefly expand on this issue of the media that Asa was talking about, because there's just one other element of it that maybe, that I feel kind of strongly about, and I write a lot about what a lot of my blogging is doing. And it was illustrated quite neatly with this sacking of an American columnist called Nathan J. Robinson, who's the social editor of this small socialist magazine called Current Affairs. But he's within socialist circles, he's pretty prominent in the US, and he had this column that he earned gradually, criticizing the American political scene mainly. And in his own time, he was, of course, on social media, as most of us are nowadays. And he tweeted about military aid to Israel, a satirical tweet that was pointing out that while Americans are struggling under the pandemic, they're not even getting their $2,000 checks, which are being whittled down to even smaller sums. All this huge numbers, billions of dollars were going to buy weapons to kill Palestinians with. And so he wrote this satirical tweet about it, and he got himself into a whole load of trouble with somebody I worked with when I was at the Observer newspaper, John Mulholland, who's the editor of the US Guardian, who sent him an email saying, essentially saying, you better apologize, which Nathan then did. And then he was cut adrift. And it was very clear that they weren't going to run him anymore because he was seen as toxic for having criticized Israel. I think we need to look, I don't think we can explain that kind of behavior by a supposedly very progressive liberal newspaper like The Guardian, simply certainly on the hassle factor, because this was something that had nothing to do with The Guardian. He was doing it in his own spare time. I think we have to look at this more in terms of what corporate media is there to do. It's there to maintain a narrative about ultimate Western benevolence. It's there to conceal the colonial imperial histories and the continuing legacy of those histories to this day. And Israel is really at the center of all of this. Not only is it at the heart of it, but also it's in maybe the weakest chain in it, because it's, as apartheid South Africa once was, it's one of these grossly offensive, visually everything offensive. You can see it's there. It's not hiding. It's really obvious, and we're paying for it all. And Britain sponsored it, and America still subsidizes it through its military. And in a sense, that's what Nathan was highlighting, that we're footing the bill for the weapons that are killing Palestinians. We can't turn our back on this. We can't pretend it's not going on. So Israel really is at the heart of this continuing Western colonial kind of exploitation of vast regions of the planet. Israel obviously sitting at the heart of a very important one, the Middle East, because of the oil. So it's because it's such a weak link, it needs very, very much defending. And these are corporate media because they are deeply invested in the Western global control of the planet. The corporate media aren't just corporate media; they're corporations that are intimately invested in all sorts of other corporate interests, including oil and weapons and all the rest of it. So Israel is deeply immersed in that whole story. So if that domino falls, the fear is what else falls with it? So corporate media, whether it's the nice, soft, liberal version of it in The Guardian, or it's the more nastier Telegraph or Daily Mail or something, doesn't matter. It's all there propping up this narrative myth that we are superior to those native people who have this terrible propensity towards violence and terrorism, all sorts of other things. Why are they so ungrateful for what we do for them? This kind of narrative needs to be, because it's so counterintuitive, and it's so against all the evidence, has to be propped up very vigorously. And you can't really allow even a newspaper like The Guardian to let go of this narrative, because that slippage would be dangerous for everything else. So although The Guardian will do certain things, it will criticize certain policies, it will be prepared to say, yes, you know, there are some things in the occupation are bad and they should be changed. It won't fundamentally address what Israel represents and its deep embeddedness in the continuing Western colonial exploitation of regions like the Middle East. So this, I think, is one of the problems why, when we are doing what we are doing, we are going to come up against enormous resistance at all levels, and everything will be thrown at us. And obviously, Jeremy Corbyn was a good illustration of somebody who was trying to disrupt that narrative, and you saw what happened to him, and it would happen to any of us if we were in similar positions of power. There's no way the corporate media, corporate politics, the corporate world we live in can allow a questioning of what's really been going on, what's still going on. So there's a lot invested in this, and we have no friends in corporate institutions, corporate media. None of them are our friends. None of them are loyal to us. None of us will help. And I think sometimes the mistakes we make are identifying with the better corporations, thinking, well, they're nicer, they're on our side. No, they're not. The clue is in the description of it as corporate media. If it's corporate media, it's not on your side. And that's why you'll see, even in The Guardian and the New Statesman, which ran the first article I noticed on this conflation of anti-Zionism or criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism, and then this conflation also with socialism as being anti-Semitic, inherently anti-Semitic. Because as socialists, we talk about global elites. What do we mean by global elites? Well, we mean global elites. No, but isn't that just coded language for Jews running the world? No, it isn't. But there's constantly this effort to delegitimize any kind of discourse that can address what's really going on. There are corporate elites running the, you know, I mean, it shouldn't be controversial even to say that. They're no longer American elites. These are transnational elites. The capital moves around effortlessly. It ignores all borders. So we ought to be able to point this out without being accused of being anti-Semites, but we are, of course. And the reason is because these corporate media, corporate institutions are not interested in socialism. They're terrified of socialism, just like they're terrified of criticism of Israel. So it's all of a package. We can't divide it up into different things. Sorry, to get to your question about the new tech companies and so on. So, social media. I mean, I've been one of the people, as Asa, who benefited from social media. It's given us platforms that just weren't available 20 years ago. I often wonder if I tried to do what I have done as a journalist. When I arrived here 20 years ago in Nazareth to write what was going on here, and I came up almost instantly against corporate media, even my friends in the corporate media. I'd literally just left The Guardian and the Observer newspapers, so I had lots of friends there. Even then, I very quickly discovered there were severe limitations on what I would be allowed to write about. Again, I was allowed to write about the worst, grossest issues involving the occupation, but as soon as I wanted to talk about the Palestinian minority inside Israel and the discrimination and racism, I wanted to look at what is a Jewish state, what does that mean? I wanted to look at the history of Israel, I wanted to look at the Nakba, any of those things. The Guardian was not interested at all. In fact, they were extremely hostile to me looking into that. And I sometimes think, well, if social media, if new kinds of platforms like the Electronic Intifada, Al Jazeera, English, if these hadn't arisen very early in my time out here, I would have done what other journalists, presumably in the decades before me, would have done. I would have either submitted to that pressure and just written what my editors demanded, because otherwise I'd have been out of a job, or I would have packed it in and I would have gone and done something else. But what I wouldn't have done is I wouldn't have spent 20 years, as I have done, here in Nazareth trying to tell you what's going on, because the best I could have done is written for some magazine that came out 3 times a year rather, and you had to wait a month for it to come through your letterbox because it was done on the cheap. Somebody had to print it and all the rest of it. So desktop publishing, online stuff, social media has really salvaged for a lot of us the ability to have an audience, or build an audience. We have to build it ourselves, but to do that and to reach out to people. And social media has accelerated that even more. It gave us a chance to build up large readerships very, very quickly in a way that just had never been feasible before, and bypass the corporate media, bypass my editors. And I kind of rode that. I've been very, very fortunate that I've ridden that wave almost from the beginning all the way through. It all broke just as I needed it to break. And if it hadn't, I wouldn't have been doing any of the things I have been doing for the last 20 years. Now, the problem is, though, that people like me are doing this. It was an unforeseen consequence. It's an unintended consequence of the whole kind of effort to diffuse, to devolve information. I don't think anybody sat 20 years ago in Facebook. Well, Facebook wasn't around 20 years ago, but in MySpace or whatever the equivalents were then. They weren't sitting around saying, well, one day people like me or Asa would be able to reach large audiences and bypass the gatekeepers of the corporate media. That wasn't what they were thinking about. They were thinking about how to make money. And in fact, they were very, very effective at making money. They made more money than any companies ever before. So they've been hugely successful. And they've gradually cornered the market in news. So nearly half of Americans get their news from Facebook. So really, these social media channels are the way that most people are hearing about what's going on in the world. And that's why there's a huge backlash on all sorts of levels to try and curb what somebody like I am doing, and find ways to delegitimize it and say it's fake news. And that's, of course, there's been a whole campaign that has attacked lots of things as fake news, but of course the Israel lobby has lost no time in promoting that idea as well. They'd be very silly if they didn't do that. So they've been trying to stop this movement, this democratization of information, which has been going on now for the past 10 years or so, to reverse it. And they're part of a much larger movement trying to do this. So but Israel has really, in many ways, was a trailblazer in finding ways to limit not only the digital rights of Palestinians, which has been very successful at doing, but also in trying to delegitimize those who are trying to speak on their behalf or in solidarity with them. We talk a lot about Vladimir Putin and troll armies. Well, Israel was doing troll armies long before Vladimir Putin, if he has got these troll armies, ever crossed his mind to unleash them. Israel was recruiting students way a long time ago. It was recruiting soldiers, ex-soldiers, existing soldiers, to join what it called its community of warriors, online community of warriors. It was involved. It got very early on. It was involved in editing Wikipedia, what they called Zionist. It even ran courses in Zionist editing of Wikipedia. Naftali Bennett, who's now has been a government minister, sort of settler leader who's a government minister, was one of the people who led that whole initiative in an early stage of his career. It had these Hasbara is a very long tradition in Israel. Hasbara is the idea. Israelis translate it as meaning explanation, but what it really is it's sort of state-sponsored, public disseminated propaganda on Israel's behalf. And it's trying to find anything you can sort of use to try and make Israel look better than it really is. And for instance, there's a Hasbara department at the Israeli airport. So when you're leaving as a loyal citizen of Israel, you can go there and they'll give you a leaflet telling you how you can impress your friends and any people you meet on holiday about Israel engineered one of the most popular cherry tomatoes. So if you like cherry tomatoes, you should love Israel, kind of thing. It really works on all kinds of levels. It's trying to persuade people to love Israel. So this whole Hasbara tradition in Israel kind of meant it hit the ground running when social media, online stuff started. Organizations, we mentioned the Anti-Defamation League, which is involved in this, but also other media organizations like Camera, Honest Reporting, these kinds of organizations, which are there really to intimidate and terrorize journalists into submission, were very active online very early on. So there was all that kind of stuff going on. it meant that Israel very quickly got involved with the big tech giants like Google and Facebook. It was very early in the game, sort of sitting down with them. All the stuff we're actually seeing going on now in America, where they're dragging Mark Zuckerberg and all these executives into congressional committees and saying, why are you allowing this and why are you allowing that? Well, Israel was kind of doing this behind the scenes a long time ago, 6-7 years ago. And we slowly got a sense of that. It started to emerge that, mainly because, of course, Israel loves to boast about what it's doing. So it gave the game away. This was also happening behind closed doors. But you get Israeli government ministers saying, we've got Google to agree to take down Palestinian sites, and they're going to block inciting material, which meant anything supportive of Palestinians, of course. So they were kind of boasting about this stuff. That's why we knew it was going on. The government sort of created a cyber unit that very quickly got compliance from groups like Facebook and Google and so on, YouTube. Israel was saying, we're getting 95% of all our requests, again boasting, 95% of all our requests are being taken down. So very early on, Israel was working on getting this sort of compliance from the tech companies, and they were very obliging. That's maybe not so surprising. In 2018, there was a conference in Ramallah where local representatives of Google and Facebook turned up to talk to a Palestinian audience about what was going on. And under questioning, they admitted that their chief rationale in Israel-Palestine was to avoid upsetting governments that might have the power to limit their commercial activities. Now, Israel has lots of ability to limit their commercial activities. They didn't put this explicitly, but it was clear that you don't need to be a genius to work out that Israel can very much limit Facebook and Google's commercial activities, both in Israel and in the occupied territories. The PA can do nothing, really. It's got no power to do anything. So if that's the way you're looking at your role as a tech giant, which governments are going to be able to curb my ability to make money? Well, then Israel, you listen to what Israel says, you don't listen to what the PA says or Palestinian civil society says, because it has no ability to intimidate you or curb what you can do. That's why Human Rights Watch in 2019 warned that Israel and Facebook were in cahoots, blurring the distinction between legitimate criticism of Israel and incitement. These social media companies started to adopt the language of Israel, which is, if you started to criticize Israel, it was incitement. So, I mean, for me, it culminated last year with Facebook announcing that they'd appointed Emmy Palmore to their oversight board. Now, the oversight board is this new idea they've got under pressure from congressional committees and so on, to create an oversight body that is monitoring bad stuff, the fake news, what do they want to call the fake news. It's basically devising a Facebook censorship policy and giving it the gloss. Not surprising, Alan Rusbridger, my former editor at The Guardian, is going to be a key figure in this. But they're going to kind of put a nice liberal gloss on the fact they're going to censor probably people like me and Asa. The idea that you would appoint somebody like Palmore, who was actually the architect of Israel's repressive policy in the Israeli government against Palestinians. That's why tens of thousands of Palestinian posts were taken down. Palestinian news agencies lost access to things like Facebook. All of that was really Palmore's doing. I mean, she was the mastermind of it. And now she's sitting on the Facebook oversight board. So that tells you everything you really need to know about what's going on here. They're in bed together. Israel is much more powerful than the Palestinian Authority. There's no competition going on here. So it will get its way. They will carry on doing what they've been doing. We saw this even we're on Zoom. Thank God we haven't been taken off Zoom yet. But, we saw that last year. Zoom is now becoming a tech giant very quickly because of the pandemic. So last year, after YouTube and Facebook both said they were going to censor a San Francisco State University webinar that involved Layla Khalid, who was a sort of icon of Palestinian. She's now in her 70s, but she was an icon of Palestinian resistance from way back. Zoom joined them in taking that action. So it sees itself as now a tech giant just like them, in the same kind of league, with the same responsibility to curb any kind of criticism of Israel or anything that's seen as anti-Israel. And even Zoom then censored a second appearance that Layla Khalid was going to make at the University of Hawaii, talking about censorship. So she was a bit like what's happened with us here, being censored from talking about censorship. So this is the way things are going. It's the face of the future, I'm afraid. And we've now got private companies doing it. So everybody says, if you say, well, it's wrong, they say, well, they're private companies. Why shouldn't they do it? It's their decision, as though it would be all right for the water company to decide to cut off a whole town from the water supply because it's a private company. Well, no, these now, the right to be heard, the right to have a platform, it's gone into the digital realm. That's where you have a right to speak. So if on private company grounds, policy, terms of service agreement, you suddenly decide, well, anybody who wants to criticize Israel isn't allowed to, we can't really say that's just a private company exercising its rights to do what it wants. It's an attack on free speech. But that's the way they're going to try and sell it to us. So it's dangerous times. The Israel lobby will be pushing, Israel and the Israel lobby will be pushing very hard to, once you've created this idea that what we're doing in criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic, or is incitement, or is delegitimization, all these different words used about it, of course, then it becomes an easy sell to the social media companies to say, you've got to ban these people, because they're inciters, they're anti-Semites, so on. So just in a sense, what's happened to the Palestinians is it's the face of the future. It's what's going to happen to most of us if we want to step out of line from this narrow Overton window, the acceptable sort of liberal mainstream discourse. We're going to be in trouble.
And even today, I think the petition was handed into Facebook, which was objecting to Facebook wanting to make Zionist and Zionism, those words, as a part of their protected speech. In other words, to make them a proxy for Jew or Jewish. And, there has to be real pushback at the moment, because otherwise we won't be able to describe a political ideology. And as you say, Palestinians won't be able to describe the ideology that has dispossessed them for generations. I'm very aware of the time at the moment. So just to sort of, a last question for Asa before we go over to allow our wonderful audience to ask you questions. Is there any pushback, do you see, Asa? Can you, do you think there's grounds to think that perhaps attempts to silence the critics of Israel may not succeed?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started off being quite pessimistic, and I want to be optimistic now, I suppose, because, when I think the very first time I ever did a talk about Palestine was when I was in my 20s, I was probably 25, and I'd just come back from my first trip to Palestine when I was a volunteer with the International Solidarity Movement, and I was just doing a little slideshow, a little PowerPoint with some of my photos from the West Bank and, settler attacks against Palestinians and army violence and so forth. And I was invited by an activist group I can't remember where, I think it might have been York. 3 people came, and one of them was, someone pro-Israel who'd come to criticize me, which is, fine, but it wasn't a very good turnout. So just the fact, I think did we have about 80 people watching in this meeting at the peak of it? It's less now, but we had quite a lot of people there, and I'm sure we'll get a lot of more views online on Facebook. And there's all sorts, I suppose a silver lining to all the horror of this pandemic has been lots of these online meetings, and we see a real interest there. So, and the very fact that Israel has to resort to this kind of censorship that Jonathan described so well and that we've discussed in this meeting is actually a sign of weakness, strategically speaking. So like in the last 5 or 6 years, when I've been writing all this stuff about the Labour Party, I've had to do, a bit of a crash course in Labour Party history because I didn't really care about it before. I knew that the Labour Party historically was extremely pro-Israel, but I don't think I've quite realised the depth that it went to. And I actually read recently in this PhD dissertation about the history of the Labour Party's links with the Zionist movement. There was actually a Labour Party figure who was involved in the drafting of the Balfour Declaration itself, essentially handing Palestine, expressing an intention to essentially hand Palestine over to the Zionist movement, to European settlers, essentially to come over and take over from the indigenous Palestinian Arab people. So, these links go way back. The Labour Party, were the top echelons of the Labour Party was incredibly pro-Zionist. People like Harold Wilson, was very, very pro-Israel. So there's these strong links. So actually, although it was defeated, the Jeremy Corbyn years showed that they don't have the grassroots, that when we saw for 2 years in a row, Labour Party conference 2 years in a row, we saw this groundswell of resistance from Labour Party grassroots to what was being done to Jeremy Corbyn, all the Palestinian flags waving on the floors of a Labour Party conference. 2 years in a row, boycotts of Israel were passed, motions on boycotts of Israel were passed. The second one even recognised the Palestinian right of return. Historic. Although, of course, it wasn't implemented into the Labour Party actual platform, unfortunately, the right of return, but there was elements of boycott into the 2019 Labour Party manifesto. It said it would end arms sales to Israel. Amazing. If you think about it historically, that is a real sign of hope. In 1945, Labour Party's official policy was that Palestinians should move out. That it was essentially ethnic cleansing, that it was endorsing a so-called Jewish state as in Palestine, So that is a massive sea change, and it's a sea change on the popular level, which is important. And it is why Israel is so worried. And as long, that is the sign of hope. The sign of hope is that as long as Palestinians continue to resist what is being done to them, the ethnic cleansing, the long-term slow genocide of an entire population, as long as Palestinians can continue to resist that, and they show no signs of doing so, after more than 120 years of settler colonialism in Palestine, then, it's a historic movement of an entire people. And it's a movement, it's more than the rights of one particular people. It's about, what I think inspires us all is that it's about a universal struggle for human rights and freedom, and equality. And that's what it comes down to. It's about equality. And as Jonathan described, so often the Palestinians are sort of the canary in the coal mine, because in many ways, Israel is the last European colony, in the so-called third world. There is also Western Sahara, and there's a few, I think, Spanish enclaves still in Morocco. I think that's right. So there is some exceptions and stuff like that, but really Israel is the last outpost of European colonialism in this way. So it's become this symbolic struggle for equality and freedom and human rights, and to me, that is the hope. And so whatever forms of struggle that we take forward, and whatever ways we can continue to resist and continue to support the Palestinian struggle, we'll keep on doing that.
Thank you. Jonathan, do you have final thoughts on that cause for hope?
Well, I thought Asa gave a very good, hopeful message there, so I don't want to dilute it in any way. I agree with him. I think there's a price that's being paid here by the lobby, which is that it is looking very authoritarian and repressive. And I think that's probably quite good from our point of view. I think people sort of, it's outstaying its welcome by constantly popping up at different times. The damage it did to Corbyn, I mean, I think it damaged itself at the same time. People like me have been trying to argue for a long time that we don't really live in a democracy, that corporate media kind of controls the narrative, and it's very hard for people to get real information. And the whole system is kind of rigged to stop them finding out what's really going on. And I think that was seen as a kind of loony left position 10 years ago. But I think it looks to more people less like that after what happened to Corbyn and what The Guardian did in destroying Corbyn. I think that really opened a lot of people's eyes to how rigged the game is. And it's bad that the game is rigged, of course, but it's better that people understand that we live in this illusion that, some nice guy can turn up who wants to change the world for the better, and the corporate media, The Guardian, the Labour Party is all going to just let that happen smoothly and let democracy run its course. We've seen it doesn't work that way, that there are elements within the Labour Party which will work to destroy the leader of their party and avoid allowing him to be elected prime minister to protect favoured causes, which isn't just Israel. I mean, it's also neoliberal orthodoxy and lots of other things, but part of it is Israel. So all of that, I think, works to our benefit. I think there's more suspicion of the system, more distrust. The challenge for us is not to let that seep into a kind of cynicism. We want people to be skeptical, but we don't want them to become so cynical that they end up voting for, populist right-wing leaders, the kind of, that we are seeing popping up because they at least get the platforms. We're denied the platforms, but the neoliberal crowd that are essentially in charge of things would rather have a Trump or a Bolsonaro or a Boris Johnson in charge of things than allow anybody like Corbyn anywhere near power. And that's the reality of it. So we have gained from the distrust that people have of the system and the sense they have that it's rigged. But the danger is that they get waylaid by these kind of populist right-wing figures. So that's the challenge for us, is to keep banging on that, yes, the system is rigged, but that, people like Johnson and Trump are not the solution.
Well, we certainly won't be deterred from speaking out, and we're finding on the ground that people generally, as you say, Asa, have a lot of sympathy and understanding of the Palestinian plight now and want to show their support. And we're going to have a few questions because I don't want to make this last forever, because people have been very patient and they did ask their questions a while back. So this came from Stephen Watters. I don't know if either of you know the answer to this. Is it known if media outlets have adopted the IHRA definition? Do we know if any of them?
That's a good question. I've not heard of anything like that, but I mean, media organizations don't tend to be very transparent about these kind of things. I mean, this is an interesting question itself, because there's been legal opinions about how the IHRA definition is not legally enforceable anyway. Like, it doesn't have, because it describes it as it describes itself as an advisory opinion. I mean, I don't think so. It's interesting.
I would just say that I think it would be very unlikely a media organization would publicly say that it's adopted this definition. That's not the way that media present themselves. But that doesn't mean that it could, for instance, when I was working at The Guardian, we all got a copy of the style book, which was, it was mostly about language, but it also had certain kinds of ideological things we should avoid that might be offensive to people. And it may well be that an organization like The Guardian has incorporated part or all of the IHRA definition and examples into its style book. We'd need a whistleblower, though, to be sure of that.
Yeah, so if there's any Guardian whistleblowers watching, email me at asa@electronicintifada.net.
We want to know, what are the policies? So I have a question from Tony Greenstein, who would like to ask if either of the speakers would like to comment on the use of identity politics to portray, for example, the Jewish students as victims in the David Miller case, and probably more generally about the smears, the anti-Semitism smears, how identity politics plays into that.
Yeah, it's a good question. just to add quickly before I answer that, the commenter earlier who said it was £50,000 that went to Keir Starmer was absolutely, and I wasn't sure about it, was absolutely right. It was £50,000 that went to Keir Starmer. Donation from Sir Trevor Chin, who a retired auto industry mogul, who's funded Labour Friends of Israel and Conservative Friends of Israel, BICOM, Jewish Leadership Council, lots of groups like that. I wrote an article about it when it came out. Yeah, so that person was right. I have a problem remembering the figures of money sometimes because EI, we're headquartered in the US, so I have to put it in convert the pounds into dollars. So anyway, yeah. So it shows the immense amount of money. On Tony's question, yeah, it's a really good question, Tony. I mean, this was a major feature of the Labour anti-Semitism smear campaign, was this kind of utilization of a certain form of identity politics to defend Israel and to defend Zionism, and we see that especially in the David Miller case. So like 20 years ago, they were trying the same things in the US. So Professor Joseph Massad at Columbia University, a Palestinian-American professor of intellectual history and Arab politics and so forth. He's this Palestinian academic giant, but they had a long-term campaign to get him fired, and Barry Weiss, who until recently worked at the New York Times, was, as a student, I was at the forefront of that campaign, and now has the chutzpah to talk about cancel culture and all that kind of thing, where she was trying to get this important Palestinian intellectual not only cancelled but fired, actually lose his livelihood and to lose his academic and intellectual influence on campus. And part of that, and there's these organizations like in the US. From these really right-wing demagogues, people like David Horowitz, who used to run websites, basically these really McCarthyist website lists of things called Campus Watch, about all these terrible, evil anti-Zionist professors. And a part of that strategy was to coordinate that effort with pro-Israel student activists on campus, who would then say, "Oh, as a Jewish student on campus, I'm feeling threatened. That I'm feeling that I'm being attacked and I'm in danger and all this kind of stuff." And it is a utilization of identity politics, because it's saying that, hashtag listen to whoever, right? So it's just sort of saying, well, if someone's saying something from a particular identity point of view, you have to believe what they're saying and take it at face value. So that might be, in lots of circumstances, that might be a reasonable position to take. So, but when there's reason to believe that someone's being dishonest about something and they might have an ulterior motive, it is also reasonable to question that. And what has quite often been attempted to be applied in the Labour Party, and particularly by a particularly poisonous pro-Israel academic called David Hirsch. He calls it the Livingston formulation, and he what is trying to be done there is he's trying to apply the Macpherson report, a particular misinterpretation of the Macpherson report. So the retired judge who did the inquiry into police racism institutional racism in the case of the murder of the black teenager Stephen Lawrence in 1993 by a gang of white racists, who one of whom was part of a crime family who were, known to the police. The police, there was a massive amount of corruption there. Well, we're all familiar, but the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, it's one of its recommendations was that when a crime is being reported as a hate crime, it should be reported for the purposes of investigation. Should be recorded as a racist crime, right? But then that then it didn't then follow that it would then ultimately be ruled to be racist. It would still have to be investigated in the normal way. There would still have to be evidence for it, right, for it to be a hate crime. So, but what pro-Israel organizations, Israel lobby, has really made a big effort to do in the last few years especially, is to take that and twist it and say, well, if I say as a Jewish person, or not even as a Jewish person, right, people like Joan Ryan, the former chairperson of Labour Friends of Israel, not a Jewish woman, not a Jewish person, but was very, very vocal about accusing people of anti-Semitism. If someone essentially pro-Israel or someone who is a Zionist accuses someone of anti-Semitism, you have to take that person at their words, no matter what, end of, you know, and they missed off all the rest of it about, well, it has to be, you know, there still has to be evidence. There still has to be some kind of objective evidence that, yes, it is racist, it is anti-Semitic. But what essentially they're trying to do is to change Zionism from a particular political ideology of settler colonialism and racism and discrimination against Palestinians solely and exclusively because they're not Jewish, into an issue of personal subjective identity, where you say, oh, well, I'm a Zionist and, you know, you're attacking me and I feel threatened, you know, and this is a really dangerous perversion that we see that's happening. And it's had quite a lot of effect, you know, in the Labour Party. And there has been people on the left in the younger generation who've got very confused about this issue and have tied themselves in all kinds of knots. And it's caused a really bad, it was really, in my view, a major factor in the downfall of Jeremy Corbyn, the refusal to fight against this. And we see this now spilling over into the case of David Miller, where the pro-Israel organizations are essentially, you know, in the same way as with Joseph Massad, it was done with Joseph Massad, are coordinating with pro-Israel students, activists on campus at Bristol University, who are then claiming that they feel threatened and uncomfortable. You know, they're using all these buzzwords, I feel uncomfortable, I feel unsafe, all this kind of stuff. And you see, and then, and rather than that, what they're trying to do actually is trying to shut David Miller down because he's a very effective academic researcher into the true nature of lobbies, of the influence of money and these kind of networks and PR lobbies into our political life. And in this case, the Israel lobby, and they hate that. They hate this research being known and exposed and widely understood, and Miller's organization has been very successful in that regard, and they want to shut him down. So the most effective way to do that is say, oh, well, it's not an issue of free speech, it's about hate speech, quote unquote, so therefore he has to be fired. There was a column in the Times today by, I think it was Daniel Finkelstein, and he wrote this long piece about it, about, you know, and he's always a columnist who always talks about quote unquote cancel culture and how all these terrible students on campus who are objecting to racism and, oh, isn't it terrible that we have cancel culture? But then he did call for David Miller to be fired. But he was very in the column today. So he was very defensive, saying, oh no, it's not a matter of free speech. So I think there's a bit of a weakness there, and we do have to keep pressing on the fact actually it is about free speech, and free speech is important. And, you know, why is Israel the only racist state in the world that we're not allowed to criticize without being accused of racism? You know, if Saudi Arabia accused its critics of Islamophobia, which they have done, that does happen occasionally, but it doesn't get the traction that the anti-Semitism smear does. You know, people do not consider that credible, remotely credible within the mainstream media, that the critics of Saudi Arabia are overwhelmingly influenced by Islamophobia. Yeah, there may be some critics of Saudi Arabia that are influenced by Islamophobia. Yeah, I could see that theoretically possible. There may be one or two here and there. But, you know, most people offended by Saudi Arabia are offended by its actions, you know, about its different crimes. And so in the same way about, you know, what it's doing in Yemen, a genocidal war against the people of Yemen and so forth. And in the same way, most people who are critical of Israel are critical of it because of its crimes against the Palestinian people, against indigenous people of the land, and against neighboring countries.
Absolutely. Do you have anything to add to that, Jonathan?
That was a very full answer, so not much, but I would just say that when people are using this language of causing offense and feeling threatened, all I can think of is, well, hang on a minute, when you're doing this in the defense of Zionism and Israel, that if you're espousing Zionist principles in the classroom at university, you're probably causing offense and threatening Palestinian students. They probably feel pretty threatened by people talking about Zionism, which is having terrible repercussions for family members back in Palestine. So why is the offense of these Jewish students, the fact they've taken offense, more important than the offense that they're causing to, or the feelings of being threatened that they're causing to Palestinians? All we're doing is displacing the racism to a different point, where we're saying Palestinian emotions and feelings about this don't count at all. Only Jewish students have feelings and emotions. So it's just another way of a repackaging of the same racism, as far as I'm concerned.
I'm going to make this the last question because we've gone to 2 hours. So it's a question from David Cohen, who wants to know that with the recent reports about apartheid in Israel, from especially B'Tselem, do you think it would be appropriate to refer to Israel as apartheid Israel, just like Asa referred to apartheid South Africa? Would that be the correct definition or term to use?
Well, I'd be happy to give a very short answer to that. Yes, it is apartheid Israel.
Well,
yeah. I mean, the only thing I would add to that, the only qualifier, that in some ways it's worse than apartheid. That's not just restricted to apartheid. I mean, it's a great that B'Tselem is saying it's all apartheid, whether it's in the occupied territories or it's inside Israel. And my view has always been what's going on inside Israel is apartheid. It's a more sophisticated, cleverer version of apartheid than South African apartheid, but it's basically the same thing, just packaged slightly differently. I would say what's going on in the West Bank and in East Jerusalem is apartheid plus. It's apartheid plus ethnic cleansing, which you could argue there were elements of that within South African apartheid in trying to get black people into the Bantustans and so on. But Israel is doing it very aggressively, has been doing it for a very long time. And I think when we're talking about Gaza, I think it's hard, when you've got the United Nations saying that, we've reached a point where Gaza is not habitable for its population anymore, to say doesn't this start to drift into something even uglier than apartheid or even ethnic cleansing, which becomes genocide. So if we're going to talk about Israel, yes, sure, we shouldn't have any hesitation to say it's apartheid Israel. But I think we all ought to be careful not to just limit it to that and be aware that there are other things going on there that are even worse than apartheid.
Well, that's probably the subject of a whole other discussion that we will probably host. So come back for that one. But at the risk of being accused of curtailing anyone's free speech here, I think we really do have to draw it to a close. So on behalf of everyone today, on behalf of the Hastings and Rye Palestine Solidarity Campaign, I'd just like to then extend our deepest gratitude to Jonathan and to Asa for speaking today. It's been really informative, really enlightening, and really helpful, particularly to all of us in the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, to try and understand what's been going on and to try and put a form to the attacks that we have all experienced, and that's not just up and down the country, but globally. So please do take a look at Jonathan's blog if you haven't already, jonathan-cook.net, and go and see Asa's work on the Electronic Intifada website. And if you are able to do, please do support their very important work. We are grateful to you, our audience, for coming today. Thank you very much. We are a small, but we're a very active campaigning group which aims to raise awareness and understanding of the Palestinian struggle for justice. So if you are local, please consider joining for just £10 annual membership or £5 unwaged. And you can be part of this really important movement for justice, equality and freedom. Or if you'd like to support our work without joining, you can make a donation. We're going to put the details up in a minute. If you're not local, please do consider joining the national PSC because they have over 60 local branches across the country, and they're all doing really vital and important work fighting racism, inequality and apartheid. We're going to put up that information now. But again, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Asa. And thank you, everyone else, for coming.
Thanks for giving us a platform. All the best.
Thank you. Thanks.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.